to ensure the filling of God the Holy Spirit, who is our true teacher and our true mentor. So with a moment of silent prayer, let us pray. And Heavenly Father, we come before you this day in praise and worship and in glorification of you and your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, we thank you for your Spirit that gives us tremendous power to learn your word and take it in and also then apply it in our lives. We ask that you be with us as we delve into the history and the political backdrop of the Old Testament this evening, so that these our knowledge of the history and things that were going on makes the Bible be even more alive to us, and we have greater and better understanding of your great plan of our salvation. So, Father, we thank you for this time that we have together. In Christ's precious name we pray. Amen. All right, so again, encountering the Old Testament, that's what we have. And remember, I'm reading and referencing the first edition, which was back in 1999. Some of you have the second edition, and others have the third edition, which is the most recent. And from what I understand, the second edition goes very much in line with the first edition, but the third edition has some changes to it. So there may be some additions and some subtractions from the things that I'll be noting, but I think even those are going to be somewhat minor. So feel free to follow along with whatever version you have. So tonight in chapter 2, what we're going to note, again, where and when did the events of the Old Testament take place? Basically, we're going to do a good history of the political and, as we would also call the empires that were designed and built, or the civilizations that were built prior to when really the Bible kicks in. Now, remember, the book of Genesis starts with Adam and Eve, or Adam and the woman in the Garden of Eden, and we go through that process, and then we see Noah, and then Babylon, and then we have the story of Abraham. And that basically ends the book of Genesis, where now from Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, I should say, we also see now Moses beginning in the second book with the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. And then basically the rest of the Old Testament is all about that time period from Moses all the way down to about several hundred years before Jesus Christ came onto the scene. So the majority of the Bible is wrapped up in that about a 1,500 year, about almost 2,000 year time period. So really 2 millenniums that we're talking about for the ancient days and the people of Israel to understand their history and their culture. And now what's also interesting about that, and the writers of the book mention this right off the bat, which I'll bring to your attention as well, is that within the New Testament, we have a history of what? Predominantly the life of Jesus Christ, and then several years after that. And in totality, if you talk about when John wrote the book of Revelation, you're talking about a 100-year time period that the New Testament enfolds or encompasses, where we have the Old Testament that really talks about 2,000 years. So we have to have a good understanding of what that 2,000-year time period was. What went on prior to, again, the Israelites in Egypt, and then being enslaved, and then the Exodus, and then what happened with their country and society after that time period as well. So that's what we're going to delve into, where and when did the events of the Old Testament take place. We're going to go through that and understand it in better detail. Now, the outline that we have here on page 5 of the first edition that I have is where did the events of the Old Testament take place? We're going to talk about 3 regions of the ancient Near East. We're going to talk about 4 sub-regions of Israel, again, how the topography of Israel is broken down, and then the 2 highways of the Near East, so the ancient Near East, as we would call that. And when we say highways, again, trade routes and roads of passage, because they didn't have highways the way we do today. Basically, there were paths in the wilderness, but some were more major than others, as we're going to see. But that was a very important aspect of creating the land of Israel and the socioeconomic status of that region at the time. And then also we're going to see what events does the Old Testament describe. We're going to talk about Israel's ancestry, the patriarchs as we call it, Israel's beginning, Moses and Joshua, the statehood from David the Davidic dynasty, which really was David and Solomon, and then also Israel's exile and restoration in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we're going to give that an overview this evening and understand what these things are all about. There's objectives on mine. There's some objectives that we're going to see. I won't go through all those now, but we'll identify them as we go along. Now, as I said, the New Testament spans about 100 years of time period. The Old Testament, really 2,000 years, when we talk about the book of Exodus all the way down to the book of Malachi. But the book of Genesis spans another several thousand years from the time of the Garden of Eden all the way down to Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. And then also Joseph going down into Egypt and understanding that. So again, we get about a 2,000-year time period that most of the Old Testament covers, except for the book of Genesis, which spans a little bit more. And so down in the first main paragraph, where did the events of the Old Testament take place? Again, ancient Israel, as it is today, is really only a small geographic location. It's only a small area, as you know. And let me kind of get my pointer going on. I've got a little map up for you here, as you can see that. But as you know, down in this area that's on this map called Palestine, again, this is what is the land of Israel, and as it is today, and pretty much as it was during the ancient days as well, when God promised first that land to Abraham, and then later on to the people of Israel. And it really encompasses a broad area. Again, a broad area where it comes all the way, it's kind of surrounded by some geographical areas. This whole, what we call this whole Middle East area, it encompasses the Persian Gulf, and that's kind of a border there. The Red Sea is a border down on the south side. There's the Arabian Desert, again, a huge desert that people don't live in and traverse frequently, and certainly didn't in the olden days as well. So that was a huge boundary, which gave this area freedom and protection as well. Then you had these Zagros Mountains here in what is now the border between Iran and Iraq. And then also you had the Caucasus Mountains up here that made a barrier between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. So again, you had a borderline there as well. And then certainly to the far west, you had the Mediterranean Sea. So you had a lot of geographic boundaries that really gave protection to this overall region for the most part. And what else is very interesting about that is that it was also a very fertile area. And that's why we have this phrase called the Fertile Crescent. So you see that there up on the board. And that Fertile Crescent really is made up because of the major rivers that were going through these lands. And here we have the Tigris and Euphrates that still are there today. And then down here is Egypt, as you know. And there we have the Great Nile River. And that in other maps, and let me just show you this other map real quick, that in other maps, that also is considered to be part of the Fertile Crescent. And the reason it's called the Fertile Crescent is because this was an area that was very lush and green because of the moisture in the water, both in the rivers and then also for the Mediterranean Sea, the rains that would come in, and ultimately fertilize this area and allow for growth. And it's called the crescent because it is in the shape of a crescent, okay? So that's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. But because of these things, because of the main rivers on what we know as Iraq today, and also was Egypt and still is Egypt today, again, they were able to have great fertile areas, great agriculture, and therefore they had great commerce. And for the people of Palestine and also Syria, and this is actually called the Syria-Palestinian area, that was that region there, and but that also was very fertile because of the winds coming off of and the moisture coming off the Mediterranean Sea that would help fertilize that area. So this area was really broken down into three major geographic locations, as you can see. First, we have Mesopotamia, which again, it makes up part of Iraq as we know it today. And that was between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And so that's all in this area. And that was a major center and also a major empire and several major empires prior to the people of Israel and then during the people of Israel as well. And because of its great fertility, its great economic place and status and situation, it was a great place to live and then also to thrive. And so that, therefore, empires could grow there and people could live there and grow there very well. As you also probably are aware that, again, below that, let me just go back to that previous slide. Oh, not that one, not there yet. Oh, okay, lost my, what did I do here? Hold on, let's see if I get it back by doing this. No. All right, what do I do? I guess I'll go like that. There we go, okay. And then let me do page up. Okay. So again, this being the Mesopotamia area, what also you can understand that because of the desert area, here, and then also in the very mountainous areas around that, that didn't have a lot of water and ultimately weren't fertile areas, they weren't good areas to live in. And so very few people lived in those areas at that time. But because of the fertility, many people lived in that Mesopotamia area. Let me go back to that slide. And then also because of the Nile River, what happened to my pointer? Let's go back. Hold on. Now let me go to the previous. That's what I want. Okay. Let's go now. Yeah. Page up. Page. There it is. Okay. Come on, slides. There we go. Oh no, you know what? I'm way off my slides. Let me just go back this way. There it is. Okay, that's what I wanted. So you have three regions of this Fertile Crescent: Mesopotamia, we've talked about, and then also the Egyptian area based on the Nile River and the fertility that came from that, and then also the Palestinian and Syria area, which is called Syria-Palestine. So those were the three main regions that made up the area. And Mesopotamia, again, between the Euphrates and the Tigris River, again, was a very fantastic place made up of somewhat of Iran today, and then also Syria and Lebanon make up that area, along with Iraq, as we've noted. And one of the difficulties was that there was always flooding and ever-presence for flooding in that area, so they always had to watch out as to make sure that, the rivers weren't flooding and wiping them out. They always had to keep a good eye on it and make sure that they could continue to have the agriculture as they needed to, for their survival and for their trade. One of the aspects about the Mesopotamia area is that even in that Fertile Crescent, even though it had some of those boundaries that we talked about in the mountainous area, it was a pretty open area for people to be able to come in and traverse. And basically, as we've seen throughout the history, empires coming in and taking them over. And it kind of was a pathway. And even later on, when the Greeks, and the Romans did their world domination and conquering, they would come right through this area and continue to head east into Iraq and India and those other areas. So it was an area that a lot of people could come and go, so there was a lot of different mixing of cultures over its years. And so it created a kind of a diverse culture and a very different culture. Now, in page 38 of my book, when it talks about Mesopotamia, it goes on in one of the middle paragraphs. It says, scholars of the earliest human history believe civilization began in the foothills north of the Tigris River when ancient Mesopotamians of the Neolithic age, and they say about 7,000 BC, first cultivated plants, domesticated animals, and began farming. And then they go on to say that sometime around 3100 BC, the Sumerians invented writing in southern Mesopotamia when they discovered that they could use wedge-like shapes on various materials to represent words. And the wedge-shaped writing known as the cuneiform, and again from the Latin cunus, which means wedge, and forma, that means form, was most easily incised into wet clay, a substance readily accessible in the southern Mesopotamia area. So I have a picture of that for you, and hopefully you can kind of see it. And I've got kind of two pictures. This one is in a stone that looks like it was part of a wall area, and you see the writing that's in there. This is a little bit better. You can see it a little bit bigger. As with most other foreign languages, you wouldn't be able to make heads or tails from them if you don't know what the language is. But in this language, you can see they would draw like wedges, and here's some double wedges, and some other kind of squiggly line wedges, and a combination of wedges, and that became an alphabet for them. And based on those wedges that they could just put into these clay forms and then dry them up, again, they would have writing and be able to have communication through them throughout their region. We've got another picture of that on the next one. And here we see, again, another kind of in one of the ruins. Let me just get over here. You see up here in part of this rock, you see more of that indentation in the wedge-shaped type of writing that they had in the Mesopotamia area. And then down here you see another more graphic one with some imagery and pictures, but then on the sides you see the kind of the indentation type of writing that they had back in that day. Okay, so again, cuneiform was the type of writing, and many scholars think it was the most ancient writing that mankind had created. All right, so then the next paragraph after that, it says, the potential good life in Mesopotamia was no secret to others living in the ancient Near East, with no natural defenses, again, because, again, it was a wide open kind of a valley of an area. Again, with no natural defenses, those enjoying life in Mesopotamia had to keep an eye on external threats. And throughout their history, Mesopotamia saw an influx of many external people and powers and threats coming their way. Later on, the Sumerians were followed by a long succession of Semites of various nationalities. And then also during the last quarter of the 3rd millennium BC, the first group of Semites, the Akkadians, rose to power and occupied southern Mesopotamia together with the Sumerians. Again, but in the turn of the millennium, another Semitic group known as the Amorites began to arrive in numerous numbers. They dominated the next 1,000 years of history in Mesopotamia. The Amorites eventually established what called major foci of power, which are basically major centers of power, in the south at Babylon, on the Euphrates, in the north of Assura, and Nineveh along the Tigris. So they had various regions in Babylon, and then up to the north and the tops of the rivers. So the Babylonians in the south and the Assyrians in the north were two of the most important groups of Mesopotamia and played a significant role in the Old Testament history. All right, and then the next section is about Egypt. And again, we've seen that the Egyptian area. Let me just jump down to a slide here. Okay. Now, let me go back up. I'm going to go back up. Nope, wrong way. I'll come back. Probably don't need to show you this, but you all know where Egypt is anyway. So, but again, the next major center was the Egyptian area. And again, as we just talked about in the Mesopotamia area, there was major empires there, uniformity of people, and over time, there were several major empires. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. But then the other major empire of that day, the major civilizations, were in Egypt. And again, down where Egypt is today, and based upon the Nile River in that area. And like Mesopotamia, the reason that it was a major source or a major center and a major civilization area is because of the river and the fertility that the river brought to them, and the rich clay, the rich soil that came from the river. And it's interesting in the book when they talk about the Nile River, it's that every June the Nile would raise and somewhat flood over its banks and then recede to its normal level by September. And they look forward to that every year because that was a form of fertilization of the area for them, so they could continue to plant and have their agricultural economy as necessary. And then also in the book it says that they would thank the god king called Pharaoh for that happening each and every year. So it was kind of interesting how they thanked false god and false god worship, but actually what our Lord had put in place eons and eons ago. So again, they dominated the geographical area and were one of the major centers of population and culture. And 90% of the ancient population of Egypt lived in that fertile valley area, and ultimately continued to thrive there for many thousands or many hundreds of years anyway. Now, let me go back to another aspect of what the Egyptians gave to us. because similar to what we saw in the cuneiform in the Mesopotamia area and writings that they had developed, well, the Egyptians had created their own form of language called hieroglyphs, which you're probably very familiar with as well. And again, I've got some pictures that aren't in the book for you of those hieroglyphs. And in this case, you have major writings and drawings on what would be a large building here. And as I've talked to you before, the Egyptians would keep their history records on their buildings or on the pillars of their buildings, and they would write the various major history events there so that they would have an eternal record of them. Just as our Lord is going to have a history section and pillars in the heavenly state. But again, the Egyptians were the ones that started that. They created their own language. And again, it also called hieroglyphs. And it has more, it was more of a pictograph type of language and letters. And each of the pictures represented a various letter of the human language. And I didn't add it to this, but looking online, I saw some charts that show you each one of these pictures and what they represent in our alphabet. And basically, it's the same 26 letters of our alphabet, plus they include a symbol for SH, and then they also have some double vowel points or combination of vowels, as we would have single vowels. They'd have combination of vowels that would be different hieroglyphs. But in any case, they would develop their language. They developed their language that way, very pictorial, and then from that they were able to transcribe various events and important historical things that happened within their culture. Again, that looks like even a more complicated type of language to me, and a very arduous one as well. Could you imagine trying to write this all the time in the drawings? Kind of like when you look at, if you've ever seen Chinese. Japanese is a little more simple than Chinese, but the Chinese language is, or writing is just, you know, all the little signs and symbols and all the little drawings that they have is pretty intense for the different way of communicating that they have. So, again, the hieroglyphs are very complicated in that sense as well. So then we get to the Syrian and the Palestinian region. And again, there's a lot more in the book in regard to the time of Egypt and the various kingdoms. They had kind of an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and then a new kingdom. That was all around 2700 BC, middle kingdom about 2000 BC, and then the new kingdom about 1500 to 1100 BC. And so one last thing in regard to the Egyptian empire and kingdom is that because of its geographic location, they didn't seem to get bothered by other people very often, okay? And so therefore they were able to maintain their kingdom and have a succession of kingdom, passed down from generation to generation over and over again. So, not a lot of change there in Egypt, and it's interesting that Egypt even exists today, with that name, unlike many of the other countries and states and empires of the ancient Mideast no longer exist in name form today. All right, so Syria and Palestine, and that's what we have up on the board now in the map that I've showed you, or shown you. And then in your books too, on again in my book on page 37, I don't know if you have this, and Vinny, you've got the a newer, so I don't know if you've got the same map here, but it basically kind of gives you the map of the Fertile Crescent and shows you the various areas of civilization back in the day, okay? So you can see that in your book as well. All right, so the Syria-Palestinian area, which again is the, part of that is the land of Israel and the land that God had given to Abraham and then the Israeli people. Ultimately, that is the area that we know of that is borders on the Mediterranean Sea. And then to the back of it, as you can see, is the Syrian desert and the Arabian desert. And then, as you know, to the north and south, you have Egypt to the south, and then you had the Mesopotamia, the various forms of the Mesopotamia empires to the north. What was interesting about this, and still is somewhat today, is that because of its location, and because of its geographic area for that small strip of land, they were able to traverse through that area. In other words, they could build highways and ultimately, have trade and travel through that region. whereas again to their west or to their east, again you had the desert, and people didn't want to travel that long and that far in the desert because there was no water, and it was a terrible terrain for them to be in. And then, so again, the desert being behind them, no way to travel there, so the travel had to come through that Palestinian Syria area that I have there for you up on the board. So because of the geographic location of it, it was always being traversed by people, and also was a prime area for conquest because people wanted to control the trade routes. Okay, they had trade by sea, but trade by land always had to go through this Palestinian area, as we have here on the board again. All right, so again, Syria-Palestinian area. Again, it's characterized, and the book breaks this down, and basically into 4 sub-regions that they have given to us, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. But what the first part of this area that they mention in the book, and I'll just read that paragraph. It says, in addition to forming a land bridge, and that's what they call it because it was the place of traversing from one empire to the other and from one continent to the other. It's among the 3 continents. It says the area is marked by 2 other topographical features. First, the eastern coast, called the Mediterranean Sea, forms the western boundary of this area. The coast, known as the Levant, Levant, as I have up on the board, extends for 400 miles and became the crossroads for all trade and travel in the ancient world. The second important feature in the Syrian Palestinian topography is known as the rift, called the Jordan Rift, which basically would call the Jordan Valley. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. And again, it's a great fissure that basically goes all the way down through the Israeli area. And as you know, the Dead Sea is in that place as well. And the Dead Sea goes, is actually the elevation of the Dead Sea is actually 1,275 feet below sea level. Okay, so that's almost about a third of a mile, right? About a third of a mile below sea level. Okay, is that area called the Jordan Rift or the Jordan Valley as we know it. But before I go on, this is kind of extracurricular information for you. I found something interesting about this Levant that I didn't really get until doing this study and preparing for you. And basically that whole area is called the Levant. And again, it was basically because of the coastal area, but also because this was a great place of travel and, again, the highways that they had there for trade and commerce. Now, what's interesting about the Levant? Well, in looking at, as you know, our country talks a lot about this group of extreme Islamists called ISIS, that we typically call them, okay? And the terror that they're bringing over to the Middle East now and Syria and northern Iraq. Well, you probably have noticed that every now and then people don't call it ISIS, but they call it ISIL, okay? And they replace the last S with an L. And the reason that is because the Levant is in view. And so this group called ISIS, who want to take over basically the Middle East and establish, think if they wipe out all non-Islam people, they're going to have peace and prosperity and blessings and everything is just going to be fine. If we get rid of the Jews and we get rid of the non-believing or Gentile world, again, they're what they call non-believing Gentile world, or now Islamic or Muslim world, if we get rid of them, we're going to have peace. Well, ISIL is what you hear people call them many times, and that L at the end actually stands for what is known as the Levant. And so ISIS, when you think about that, at first you just think the S would talk about the Islamic State and trying to establish that, okay? And you say, okay, well that's maybe Iraq, and they want that area because there's already Islamic people there as well, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when you put the L there instead of the S and you talk about the Levant, what does it include? Israel. And again, so the ISIL organization is another one of those that want to wipe out the Israeli people and take this land for themselves, even though God had given it to the people of Israel. And it was never their land in the first place, as you know. But in any case, I found that very interesting that the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant ultimately is talking about all of Syria, some of that northern part of Iraq, and then what we know as Israel today. And they even encompass some of Jordan there as well, as you can see on the map at the bottom. So I just found that kind of interesting that they would go back to the ancient term of that region called the Levant, which was the main trade and highways in the coastal line there of Israel and then to the north of Syria, and ultimately using that once again in their charge to wipe out non-Islamic people. And again, they even, as you know, there's the Shiites and the Sunnis, and they even fight each other because they don't agree. And I don't even know which the ISIL's are Shiites or Sunnis. You may know, but it doesn't really matter to me because they're both wrong. But in any case, just thought I'd give you that little bit extra information. All right, so the next section of the book talks about the four geographic understanding of the Palestinian and also Syrian region and land. And ultimately, it's broken down into four things. And in the book, there's another map. And again, I don't know, Vinny, you may not have this map in the newer version too. You get the same map, okay? But this map breaks it down for you kind of in a one-dimensional. And I thought I'd give you this kind of three-dimensional type of chart instead. But basically, the four regions include the coastline, okay? And that's basically kind of a, they call it the plains and the coastal plains. And that's kind of a flat land and right off the ocean. And again, you can work that land and, plant that land and also build in that land. So it's a very productive land for the people of Israel. And then you have the inner mountain region, and that's the second region that they have here, okay? And then the third region is that Jordan Valley or the Jordan Rift that I showed you, the Dead Sea, and then going all the way up to the Sea of Galilee. That's that whole rift, and basically they call it like a fissure, almost like there was an earthquake years and years ago that separated this thing, and you have this big traverse. But again, how God designed it, we don't know. And then at the backside, you have the Jordan Heights, okay, and the Jordan Mountains on the back of this area. And again, those are very tall mountains in the back of this area. So when we talk about, again, the coastal plains, again, coming from the sea and then the coastal plains, again, it was one of the richest of the ancient areas, and it had very fertile soil. Again, as the winds would blow the moisture off of the Mediterranean Sea, and they would have rains there. Again, it was very good, and they had a lot of underground springs and water that would come up as well. So it was, again, a very good area for them to develop and plant. So again, it became very fertile and a place that could provide for people, and therefore civilization could flourish in that area. Let me just go back. Actually, let me go back. Let's see. No, I guess I got to go to this map. I'll come back to that map in a bit. But another interesting thing about the coastal line is that it's a pretty straight coast, and there really are no good ports there, okay, and no gulfs, other than this one, which is Akko, or an Akka, and you have that one, and so they developed a pretty prominent seaport there, but in the rest of the area it's pretty much flatline, so not a lot of good area for seaport. Until you get up to the Syrian area and up beyond this map, there were many more areas where they could develop seaports. So because of the geographic location like that, there wasn't a lot of seafaring trade going on with the Israelites and through this Syria-Palestinian area in the ancient days. They did have the one port, so they would go to there. And then to the north, if you are familiar with the ancient days as well, in the ancient region, they would have the Phoenicians to the north of them. And in their area, there were a lot of seaports that they could build because of the topical and geographical construct that's up there. And ultimately, they could have a lot of ports and seafaring. And if the Israelites or the Palestinians wanted to have trade and transfer it by sea, they would typically go to the Phoenicians and have them help them with the trade and with the seafaring vessels that were necessary. All right, so let me go back to this, okay? All right, so again, the coastal plains, that was one area. And then the ridge in the central mountain range, again, that was another area. And in one of those areas, there's an altitude of 9,000 feet, very much to the north. This is kind of more of the southern part of it, but to the north there's an area that reaches up to 9,000 feet above sea level. And then, as I said before, get into the Jordan Rift, and again, that's 1,275 feet below sea level. All right, so this area is made up, and you can see this in the book. Again, you have Galilee to the north, Ephraim to the central, the Jordan, the Judean hills, and then the Negev to the south made up that region. Then the Rif, again, the deep valley area there that goes from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. Ultimately, a very deep rift, and it's the lowest point on planet Earth. The 1,275 feet below sea level is the lowest point on planet Earth. And then to the back, you had what was called the Transjordanian Highlands, and again, there were some good mountains there that were very beneficial to the people of the Palestinian and Israeli area because it gave them a buffer. And again, people couldn't, conquering armies couldn't traverse over those hills and hit them from that side. So they couldn't come from the east and just, blow them away, as we would say, or overrun them. So in order to take over the people of Israel or Palestine, you had to come from the north or the south. So it was much more defensible in that way. So these hills were very important in the development of the nation and the people of Israel and the land that God had given to them. All right, now, another aspect of this were the trade routes, which we talked about before. And this map's probably a little small for what you're able to see, but there were two main highways or trade routes that they had that came down through the land of Israel. And one was called the Way of the Sea, called the Via Maris, and the other was called the King's Highway. And basically in these two landmass, and I'll kind of point it out for you here, if we go back up to Damascus, I'm going to show you some other maps where, again, it shows you more of the other trade routes. But basically in Damascus, this highway would split into two, and it would come down here on the eastern side along the Jordanian mountains, and there was a pathway through those mountains, and again, that was called the King's Highway. The other way would head towards the ocean, in the Mediterranean Sea, as we would call it, and that's why they called it the Way of the Sea, or the Via Maris, and ultimately it came down through this area and then go all the way down into Egypt. So if you were coming from Mesopotamia and you wanted to bring your goods down to Egypt, again, the two major kingdoms of the day, you would have to go through this land, and they would choose either to go through the King's Highway or go down through the Way of the Sea, the Via Maris, as it's called, and bring their goods through those places. This is another map that also shows that. Again, I don't know how well you can see it, but again up here in Damascus, and then it splits and branches down. You've got the King's Highway, and then over here you have it coming down, and you have the Way of the Sea. And again, bring it all the way down to northern Egypt, where the King's Highway would come down and to Arabia, and then also to central and maybe even southern Egypt through that way of the trade routes. Okay? In the book, on page 45, again, there's another map, kind of a plain map as well, but there you can see other trade routes that throughout the Middle Eastern area as well, and you can understand what those are. And even, let me see, I think I got one more map for you. Let me go back up to this one. But even with this, you can see these red lines of the trade routes, and you can see that they were branching off even through these. These were the more minor roads, but the two major highways were on the east and then also on the west coast of the land of Israel. And then there was others that traversed through that would go from city to city, town to town, that people could travel upon as well. All right. And there's another picture of the King's Highway, and then coming down and then going over to Egypt, and the blue line is the Way of the Sea. Okay? All right, so the next section on page 44 of the book is what events does the Old Testament describe? And so when we understand what the Old Testament, again, remember it spans 2,000 years predominantly, and then at least another 2,000 years in the book of Genesis, when you go from the Garden of Eden all the way down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then to his son Joseph going down into Egypt. But basically closing off with Jacob in the book of Genesis, and then Exodus kind of picking it up after that point with the people in Egypt, and then ultimately coming out of Egypt. So, again, it spans about that 2,000 years. And we hear and we see in our Old Testament scriptures, we'll talk about the Babylonian Empire, we talk about the Egyptians, we talk about the Armenians, but then there are other empires as well in the later history of Israel after they came out of Egypt, in the Babylonian Empire, the Medo and the Persian empires that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, that were all part of the Mesopotamia region and empires that they had back in the day. But as far as Israel's ancestry, and we talk about the patriarchs, again, historians break the time down into four different time frames. They call it the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, and the Chalcolithic time periods. And they also break it down into the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And the reason they call it the Bronze Age and the Iron Age is because, you know, it's the Bronze Age when they developed how to make bronze, which is kind of a metal based on copper, which is somewhat of a weaker metal than iron. And then after developing, first they developed the bronze metal, and then later on they developed the iron metal. And so when the iron metal was developed and predominantly used, ultimately they call that the Iron Age. Okay, very simple. So we see that it's in general, about 3,300 BC is the Bronze Age or beginning, and the technology spreading throughout the ancient Near East. And around 1200 BC, people discovered the greater benefits and the use of iron. So again, for about 1,000 years, bronze was the predominant metal, but then at about 1,200 BC, we see iron coming into play, and again, being much stronger, it was utilized because it was more beneficial for their work life, but more importantly, the military life as well, and the military weaponry that they were able to build from the iron versus the bronze. So in the book, to break down these ages a little bit, the period from 3,300 BC to 2000 BC is known as the early Bronze Age. And that is a time when the Mesopotamia and the Sumerians in that Mesopotamia area came into prominence and power and strength, and they existed for quite a long time. And then what the book also says, just kind of skipping forward a little bit, it says, although precise dates for Israel's patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are impossible to determine, they may be generally placed in the Middle Bronze Age, which was about 2000 to 1550 BC. So that's when they think Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their time frame came into being. And then it was about 1500 BC that many people talk about Moses coming into the scene as well and receiving the law. All right, so again, more information in the book that you can follow and read up on. There's a nice chart in the book on page 46 that talks about the archaeological periods in the ancient Near East history, and it gives you a nice breakdown there of the different ages. And again, there's an Old Stone Age, a Middle Stone Age, and again in the book, which is kind of surprising, they go all the way back to 1400 BC. But again, I believe that it really goes back to about 6000 BC. And in the book they were kind of saying, it's impossible to get these time frames. But when you look at the genealogies that are given to us in the scriptures and the age of different people, and you kind of work that backwards, I've seen other studies that have put it together that says about 6,000 years from the time of coming out of Eden, from Adam and the woman, until the time of Christ. About 4,000 years. About 4,000 years from that time period, and then we've been about 2,000 since. So again, going back to 1400, I think they're giving over a little bit to archaeological digs and the whole carbon dating system, which is a erroneous system anyway. It gives a generality, but it's very erroneous in its dating scheme. But in any case, they go through through the book, and they have the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, the New Stone Age, and then they get into the Copper Stone Age. And again, they call it then the Early Bronze Stage, which again was a mixture of copper and iron, and then the Early Bronze, the Middle Bronze, the Late Bronze, and then you get the Iron Age 1, 2, and 3. And then it shows you also some of the other major events and historical facts and figures that were going on at that point in time, and then when Israel kind of came into the scene as well. All right, so about 2000 BC is when Abraham generally came onto the scene. We think about 2000 BC. All right, let's see. Again, there's a lot. I'm going to start, and I'm going to, see, we're already 50 minutes in. I knew I wouldn't get through all of this. Probably won't get through all this tonight, but on page 47 at the top of the page, after that chart, it talks about, it says, in Egypt, after a period of darkness and confusion called the First Intermediate Period, about 2200 BC to 2000 BC, the country once again flourished during the Middle Kingdom period, 2000 to 1700 BC. The Middle Kingdom was a time of peace and stability. This is talking about Egypt, in one of which Egypt engaged in trade with the Levant, resulting in the acquisition of considerable wealth. But towards the end of the Middle Bronze, Egypt also succumbed to the rise of Semites, which is characteristic of the Fertile Crescent throughout the period. Native Egyptian control of the country ended when the Hyksos Semites, probably from Syria Palestinian, took control of the delta in the north. Whether the Hyksos invaded and took control, or whether they had been gradually growing in strength, is not known. They ruled Egypt for about 150 years in what is called the Second Intermediate Period, about 1700 to 1540 BC. For the first time in Egypt's history, the country was conquered and dominated by foreigners. So again, they had that land all up until that time. Then in the Middle Bronze Age world, into which Abram stepped, again later being called Abraham, again he stepped, was one of the peoples on the move. In Syria, Palestine, Semitic peoples were settling in. The Canaanites were establishing city-states in the coastal plains and valleys as early as the 3rd millennium. These peoples may have been the same Amorite stock as those who had settled in Mesopotamia. All right, then it goes on, it says, Abraham departed from Ur of the Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia with his extended family and journeyed to Haran on the Euphrates in northwestern Mesopotamia. His father Terah died in Haran, and Abram, whose name was changed to Abraham, was called to travel on in faith to unknown lands. When Abraham reached Canaan, God established a covenant with him and promised to give him a vast number of descendants and the land of Canaan as an inheritance. So it's interesting that the Canaanite people had been living in that area, and I guess I'm trying to get into current day politics, but even though we call it this, it was called the Syria Palestinian area, okay, ultimately the Canaanites had that area, and then when Abraham came in, God promised that area to Abraham and then give it to the Israelites, which didn't then occur, we're going to see this in the book, didn't occur until Moses, or after the Moses generation, they came out of the wilderness and Joshua brought them into the land. So the Palestinians today who are trying to claim that land and say that it's theirs, they never were there in the first place. They were either part of the Phoenician people or the Philistines, which had a little small corner of it at the base. Basically, I'll point to it down there, where some of that land is today, down in this area down here. Okay, so I don't think I want to get to that. map as of yet. All right. So in any case, their claim to that land today is a false one because many people had it, many different civilizations had it. The Egyptians ruled it, the Mesopotamians ruled it, other empires ruled it from time to time. The Palestinians of today have no claim on that land. Ultimately, as you know, it's all God's land anyway, and God had promised that to Abraham, and that is the land for the people of Israel that God will restore during the millennial reign. All right, so God made a covenant with the people, and again, when Abraham reached Canaan, God established a covenant with him and promised to give him a vast number of descendants in the land of Canaan as an inheritance. These promises were uniquely suited for a transitory migrant Amorite looking for land to settle, and that's what Abraham was. He was an Amorite prior to that from the city of Ur. After many years, Isaac was miraculously born to Abraham's wife Sarah when she was 90 years old, and Abraham was 100 years old. Isaac's wife Rebekah had two twins, Jacob and Esau. Although Esau was the oldest, Jacob became the child of the patriarchal promises. Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, had 12 sons. His favorite son Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and taken into Egypt. While in Egypt, Joseph was blessed by God and miraculously rose to high political office in the foreign land. During a severe drought, the sons of Israel traveled to Egypt in search of food for the family back in Canaan. Much to their surprise, they were confronted by the very brother they had betrayed, and now their lives were in his hands. But Joseph provided food for them and saved their lives. Israel and all his children moved from Canaan to Goshen in the northeastern delta of Egypt. We can date these events no more precisely than the general time frame of the Middle Bronze Age from 2000 to 1550 BC. The book then also says that the Hyksos rule of Egypt, 1700 to 1550, may well have been the time when the children of Israel lived in Egypt and multiplied so rapidly. But once the Hyksos were expelled, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know about Joseph. And remember in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it kind of starts off by saying that Joseph was favored by Pharaoh. But then when Joseph died off and the people of Israel were down in there, a new Pharaoh or a new king had arisen, and he did not know Joseph. So it was probably another kingdom. It wasn't a descendant of the Hyksos empire or kingdom, but ultimately a new one that had come in. All right, so it goes on to say that the Middle Bronze Age world into which Abram... Oh, sorry, I read that already. I'm on the wrong place. Okay, let me go back. All right, so again, it continues on by saying the new king probably refers to the first king of a different dynasty. For the next several hundred years, the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians and forced to build their cities and drive their economy. All right, so the next section of the book says Israel's beginning, Moses and Joshua. So in the late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1200 BC, was one of international trade and balance of world powers, with Syria-Palestine caught in the middle. The Egyptians successfully ended their subjugation to the Hyksos and entered the period of their greatest political strength, called the New Kingdom dynasty from, dynasties 18 through 20, from 1550 to about 1100 BC. Goes on to say, whereas Egypt was dominant throughout this period, Mesopotamia experienced a time of political weakness. After the fall of the Hammurapias, again the old Babylonian Empire, southern Mesopotamia was controlled by foreigners from the Zagros Mountains called the Kassites. The long rule of the Kassites dynasty over 300 years brought peace and stability to Babylon, though not military superiority. The Kassites preferred peace treaties and other non-military means of diplomacy to defend their borders. They adopted many elements of traditional Babylonian culture and raised southern Mesopotamia to a new level of international prestige during this period. The Babylonian dialect of Akkadian became the lingua franca or international language of the day. So the Akkadian language was the main language of that time. Now, further information about Egypt. It says Egypt's powerful rulers of the New Kingdom attempted to control the coastal areas of Syria, Palestine, the coastal highway to Phoenicia, again the Via Maris, and Nubia to the south. By controlling commercial trade with the Aegean and the rest of the Western Asia, Egypt dominated trade and acquired tremendous wealth and prosperity. At the height of this empire, Amenhotep, number 4, of the 18th dynasty became pharaoh around 1353 BC. Soon thereafter, he changed his name to Akhenaten and moved the capital about 200 miles north of Thebes to modern El Marna. For about a decade, Akhenaten elevated Aten, the visible image of the sun, to a place of supremacy and became close to the monotheistic worship. All right, so basically they were worshiping the sun god back in ancient Egypt, based on this king bringing that to prominence. It goes on to say that hundreds of clay tablets written in Babylonian, the so-called Amna letters, have been found, and again in the capital, and these letters from Egyptian vassal kings in Syria, Palestine, and rulers in Anatolia and Mesopotamia reflect the politics of the mid-14th century BC. It appears that Akhenaten was no longer capable of controlling the city-states of Syria, Palestine. Whether through neglect or military weakness, Egypt began to lose its international grip in Western Asia. All right. I'm going to continue. I'm going to read just the rest of this section, and then I think we'll probably stop about where I thought I'd get, at Israel's statehood and David and the Davidic dynasty. All right, so continuing on in regard to the history of Egypt and Abraham's time period, and the people coming down into Egypt, or the Israelites coming down into Egypt. It says, sometime during the late Bronze Age, while Israel suffered under the heavy burden of slavery in Egypt, Moses was born to the tribe of Levi. At the time of Moses' birth, the Pharaoh was attempting to control the rapidly growing Israelite population by killing newborn Israelite boys. But Moses was miraculously saved by Pharaoh's own daughter and raised in the Egyptian royal court. There was providentially given There he was providentially given the finest Egyptian education, and we see that in Acts chapter 7, verse 22. So it says Moses was prepared and called by God to lead the Israelites out of their bondage in Egypt. God used a series of 10 plagues to prove he was in control of the cosmic order, not the Egyptian god-king Pharaoh. These plagues demonstrated the superiority and majesty of Israel's God Yahweh. God then used Moses to deliver Israel from Egypt and bring them to the Sinai Peninsula to establish a covenant with them. There he gave them the law to maintain the new covenant relationship and protect them in the promised land they were to inherit. The new nation Israel rejected God's leadership in the wilderness and refused to enter the promised land. Again, they didn't refuse, God didn't allow them. It's kind of a misrepresentation there. God didn't allow them because of their negativity. During this time, this rebellious generation died. Moses also died in the plains of Moab without having the privilege of entering the land promised to the patriarchs. Joshua, Moses' successor, led the nation Israel in conquest of the promised land, fulfilling the promises to the patriarchs. Though it is impossible to give these events a precise date, it is clear that the Israelite exodus occurred sometime during the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history, and scholars have proposed two possible dates for the Exodus event, approximately 1446 BC or 1275 BC. Interesting, that 1275 number. That was also the number of feet below sea level. That's kind of interesting. But again, I believe it was closer to the 1446 time period. So in any case, the question is whether the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Thutmose III, perhaps Amenhotep II of the 18th dynasty, or whether it was Ramses II of the 19th dynasty. Regardless of the inability of modern scholarship to date these historical events precisely, the Exodus narratives in the Bible reflect genuine late Bronze customs, and their factuality is certain. All right, so we absolutely know that these things did occur, but we can't necessarily put a date to it. And it's funny that anytime you see any of the movies and things that have been produced in regard to the Exodus, they always use Ramses as the Pharaoh at that time. So again, it could have been him, or it could have been the one that was prior to him, based on the various time frames. Okay? All right, so the next section is about Israel's statehood, David and his dynasty. And that kind of takes us through the rest of the book. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to do it for another day? Keep going? All right, keep going. Keep going. All right, we'll keep going. All right, now I am reading most of this part and most of this section because it is the more biblical history, where the other stuff was more kind of the extra biblical history. So I am reading this just so we can get, again, the narrative, because this is the background and setting for what we have. I mean, I could tell you these things myself, but I think I'll just continue on with the flow to give us the times, the dates, and the history of what was going on. All right, let me just get a quick little drink. All right, so around 1200 BC, cataclysmic changes began to occur in ancient Near East. The major powers, notably the Egyptians and the Hittites, and again, they were even north of Syria and into Turkey as we know it today, suddenly declined, and the political map changed dramatically. Most scholars assume the changes started with the fall of Troy around 1250 and the subsequent fall of the Mycenaean cities on the mainland of Greece. Survivors must have fled by sea along the coast of the Mediterranean, disrupting all major powers of the ancient world. These newcomers are known collectively as the Sea Peoples. One group of these Sea Peoples, known from Egyptian sources as Pelasets, settled in the southwest coastal plains of Syria, Palestine. They are known in the Old Testament as the Philistines, a term that also gave us the word Palestine. All right, so it says, of the many changes brought about by the arrival of the Sea People in the ancient Near East, two of the specific or special significance, two are of special significance here. First, within a century of their arrival, the political order that had existed for over 300 years dissolved, leaving a power vacuum. Rather than military campaigns involving international powers such as the Egyptians and the Hittites, local skirmishes and regionalized conflicts ensued. New ethnic groups filled the power vacuum and eventually developed smaller empires of their own, notably the Armenians of Damascus and the Israelites in the highlands of Palestine. The second result of the arrival of the Sea People was the spread of new metalworking technology, particularly the use of iron for making weapons. Though it is not certain which group would actually invented iron technology and first exploited it for weaponry, it is clear that the Philistines had the early advantage in battles with the Israelites due to a superiority of metalworking technology and monopoly of the use of iron. And that's also noted in 1 Samuel 13, 19 through 22. Gradually, iron technology replaced bronze, and archaeologists refer to the period after 1200 BC as the Iron Age. So the period known as Iron Age, about 1200 BC to 930 BC, began with the invasion of the Sea Peoples and the shifting of political power throughout the ancient Near East. Sometimes towards the end of the Late Bronze, Joshua and the children of Israel had taken Canaan and settled in the central highlands. For at least a couple centuries after the Israelite conquest, Israel governed itself by a loose confederation of 12 tribes, one for each of the sons of Jacob. During this time, leadership rose from the ranks of the common people on a temporary ad hoc basis. These, quote, judges were divinely gifted and ordained to consolidate the strength and resources of the tribes in times of national or regional crisis. Military threats arose from surrounding neighbors, particularly the Philistines to the southwest. Though a central governing body was not a necessity, the Israelites grew wary of constant military threats from surrounding enemies. They began to long for a permanent king and royal court to maintain their standing army and secure peace for the future. The Israelite monarchy developed because of a consistent threat of military invasion coupled with cultural pressure to become like other nations. They wanted a king over us. We want a king over us. Then they will be like all other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. 1 Samuel chapter 18, 19 through 20. Samuel was a prophet and judge who led Israel in the time of the transition from judges to kings. With God's blessing, Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. But Saul failed to maintain the relationship with God and was eventually rejected as king of Israel. Now, you also know that the people wanted King Saul. God said, you don't need a king. And Samuel was trying to tell him that, look, we have one king, that's God, that's our Lord God Almighty. And he's the one you should be following and not an earthly king. But in God's permissive will, he allowed a king to come to the fore. And again, really to show them the failure of an earthly king over his heavenly kingship over them. All right, so it goes on to say that Saul's life illustrated the importance of guarding our relationship with God as the most important task we have to do. After Saul's failure, God instructed Samuel to anoint a man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 13:14, the young David, as the next king of Israel. Under David's strong leadership, Israel finally defeated the Philistines and forged a degree of peace and security with Syria-Palestine. David's reign ushered in the period of stability that would become Israel's golden age. He unified the tribes and provided economic and political freedom. Though there continued to be much in internal strife during this reign, he was able to leave a unified kingdom to his son Solomon. This was the beginning of the dynastic succession in ancient Israel. Solomon expanded Israel's borders to the Euphrates in the north, to Egypt in the south. He ruled during the only period of Israel's history that may be called an empire. He brought great wealth and prosperity to the nation through international trade, but God gave Solomon wisdom in all matters, including the ability to govern the people. The royal court grew and became more involved in the affairs of the state. Solomon's fame as an inspiring leader spread around the world, and international contact became commonplace. Solomon also had the privilege of building God's temple in Jerusalem. The reigns of David and Solomon, or the united monarchy, would always be remembered as the ideal time of peace and prosperity. All right, let me just take a break and show you a couple of maps here. And this is the map of the people of Israel once they came into the land of Canaan, and through Joshua, and conquered the land and took it as God had given it to them. You can see each one of the tribes of Israel had taken a various portion of the land. And again, you don't see Joseph here, who's one of Israel's sons, but because God blessed Joseph, he gave him a double blessing, and he had two sons, one Ephraim, the other Manasseh, and they became two different tribes from one tribe. Should have been the tribe of Joseph, but it became the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, a double blessing for Joseph. And therefore there are 13 tribes, as we see it, of the people of Israel. Really only 12, but 13 as we have here. So you have Asher, Naphtali, you have Manasseh, you have Ebulim, I can't read it too much. Ishkar you have there. Manasseh you have here. Ephraim down here. Gad, Reuben, You have Simon, Judah, Benjamin, and then also the people of Dan over in this area, okay? So that was how they came in, and that's how they had their tribes, and they had their various judges in all the areas to lead them at that point. They didn't have one centralized king at that point in time. So they had that kind of loose confederation, as the book called it. Then, under both David's conquest and then later on Solomon's conquest, we have the United Kingdom of Israel. And ultimately, again, you can see it all there, and that was the land that was under David, and then later on Solomon. Really, Solomon expanded that land and that dominion quite a bit. And, well, this is going to be the next portion. I'll just leave this slide up for you as well. But as you know, after Solomon, again, the north and the south, they split into two groups. And you had the northern kingdom and you had the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was basically Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, and those two tribes sticking together. And then all the rest, basically from the northern kingdoms, they banded together and made their own kingdom. They had a riff and they wanted to have their own way of doing things. Okay, but we're going to read about that in just a minute. Okay, we left off there. Picking up back in the book, all right? It says, the success of the united monarchy was short-lived. Solomon, like Saul before him, allowed his heart to turn away from God. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Shortly after the death of Solomon, the kingdom split into two weaker nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This became the so-called divided monarchy. Northern Israel fell quickly into religious apostasy. The first king of the north, Jeroboam I, attempted to use religion for political purposes and compromise the practices of ancient Yahwehism, again, following the Lord, inherited from Moses. But a later king of the north went even further. Omri and his son Ahab intentionally combined Mosaic Yahwehism with Canaanite Baalanism in an attempt to gain greater political control. The northern kingdom was also plagued by political instability. Over 200 years of its history, about 931 BC to 722 BC, Israel had 19 kings in 9 separate dynasties. In 722 BC, the capital of northern Israel, Samaria, fell to the Assyrians. By contrast, Judah, the southern kingdom, continued to have one royal family, the Davidic dynasty, for nearly 350 years, 931 BC to about 587 BC. Although Judah maintained political stability, she also fell into religious apostasy, though much more gradually than her neighbor to the north. Many of the kings of Judah were faithful to the Lord, especially early in the kingdom's history. The final century of Judah's history is marked by an interchange of good kings and bad kings. Sadly, Judah's capital, Jerusalem, fell to the Babylonians in 587 BC. Archaeologists refer to Iron Age II, about 930 BC to 539 BC, which covers Israel's divided kingdom, northern Israel and southern Judah. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East at this time, Egypt was trying to reassert itself as a major world power. But except for a brief moment in the turn of the 6th century BC, called the 26th dynasty, Egypt was never again a major player in the ancient world. The real story of Iron II is the rise and fall of the new empires in Mesopotamia. So that's where we go now. Along the banks of the Tigris in the northern Mesopotamia, a new force emerged in the Iron Age that would dominate ancient Near Eastern history for 2 centuries. Assyrian imperialism emerged in the mid-9th century and began to impact the politics of Syria-Palestine. Yet Assyria went through a period of internal weakness in its first half of its 8th century. This allowed for the long and prosperous reign of Jeroboam II in Israel and Uzziah in Judah. But success is not necessarily a sign of God's approval. While both kingdoms prospered during this half-century, social injustice and moral decay began to consume the soul of Israel and Judah. This was the backdrop for the first of the classical prophets, being Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. So again, we see them and their writings coming at the fore as well. God raised up his servants to warn the nations of impending doom and to call them to repentance. Assyria's weakness was but temporary, a temporary lull in her rapacious drive for more power. The early 8th century was only the calm before the storm. When Tiglath-Pileser III, I think that's how you pronounce it, brought Assyria back to full strength in 745 BC, the nation was stronger than before and ready to be used as God's instrument of destruction against the rebellious northern Israel. Over the next 2 decades, Israel, again the northern kingdom, vacillated between paying tribute to the Assyrians and rebelling against them. Finally, Tiglath, his son Shalmaneser V, laid siege to Israel's capital Samaria in 725 BC. 3 years later, the northern nation fell in 722 and became a province in the enormous Assyrian Empire. You know what? Well, yeah, here it is. Okay, so here's the Assyrian Empire. I do have that. And as you can see from the chart below, there was the earlier one and then the later one being closer to our time frame. But you can see at first, this was including some of the northern kingdom here, and then down through the Mesopotamia area. And then later on, this whole region, and then they even took over the Egyptian kingdom as well. And they had a huge Assyrian Empire back in the day. And so they were maintaining and controlling things during that time period. All right. So it goes on to say that during the next century, Judah also attempted various ways of dealing with the Assyrian threat. For example, Hezekiah of Judah was anti-Syrian, but his son Manasseh adopted a pro-Syrian policy. During the 7th century, Assyria reached the pinnacle of its imperial power and became the first truly world empire, as well as the first in line of such empires from the Mesopotamia base, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, before the power shifted to the west, where it then became from Greece and Rome. Under the kings of the early 7th century, and it gives a list of several of those, the Assyrians were able to defeat their traditional enemies to the north. The Eurasians, they even captured faraway Egypt in 663 BC. But throughout this period of international domination, Assyria had a persistent and ever-present problem closer to home. The Chaldeans of the southern Babylonian area were growing even more rebellious and difficult to contain. They soon became independent and eventually replaced the Assyrians. So again, the Chaldeans took over. Under the able rulership of Nabopolassar and his famous son Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylonian participated in Assyria's defeat and became the next great world empire during the 43-year rule of Nebuchadnezzar. And again, during that time, Babylonia reached the apex of its wealth and political power in what is called the Neo-Babylonian period. Judah's response to Babylonian imperial aspirations alternately between 2 tactical strategies. Some favored rebellion, supported by a pathetic trust in the weakened Egypt that splintered a reed, as it's called in Isaiah 36:6. Others, such as Jeremiah, urged Judah's submission to Babylon as a vassal state. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar attempted to end Judah's rebellious streak by capturing Jerusalem and taking King Jehoiachin into exile in Babylonia, along with many of the other people of Jerusalem, including the prophet Ezekiel. Another rebellion under Zedekiah resulted in the total destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. The Babylonians not only destroyed the city and deported much of the population, but they also tore down the temple and effectively ended the Davidic dynasty. The Davidic line would barely survive through the Chin, I can't pronounce that name tonight, during the exile. The loss of the temple and kingship was a dominant and formative event in Old Testament history. It forced a rethinking of the old theological assumptions and made it necessary to formulate Israel's earlier religious convictions, especially the nature of God's covenant. All of this formed the backdrop for some of Israel's most significant prophetic figures, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and Ezekiel. All right, just a little bit more and then we'll be done. Now we talk about Israel's exile and restoration. But let me also show you in this map, after the Chaldeans, again, then the Persians came in, really kind of from Iran, and then took over that whole Chaldean empire, and basically, had that whole region, including Israel as well. And that's what we're going to read about now. But again, that's the Persian Empire from 500 BC and afterwards. Okay, so that's a good map to give you that understanding. All right, so Israel's exile and restoration, and this is really talking about Ezra and Nehemiah. The final archaeological age of the Old Testament period is the Persian age, 539 to 332 BC, otherwise known as Iron Age III. The reign of the Persian king Cyrus marks the beginning of the Persian Empire. This kingdom was one of the largest in the ancient world, stretching from the Isles of the Aegean Sea and the Nile across the ancient Near East to the Indus Valley. The Persian Empire controlled the ancient world for 2 centuries. You can even see on the map there, they even went into Libya in that area today too. So they didn't just stop at Egypt, but they also conquered the North Africa region as well. All right. All right. So the Persian Empire controlled the ancient world for 2 centuries. Alexander the Great conquered the Persians around 330 BC and ended the string of world empires from a Mesopotamian base. All right. Now let's go back. Continuing to talk about Cyrus. Cyrus established a new policy with regard to subjugating people and their deities. Unlike the Assyrians and the Babylonians, Cyrus desired to placate as many gods as possible. He felt he could better maintain and govern his vast empire with a policy of tolerance and benevolence, rather than cruelty and brutality. The Jewish exile officially ended when Cyrus decreed that captive peoples in Babylonia were free to return to their homelands and establish a degree of self-rule. The Old Testament interprets this historical event as the fulfillment of the prophecy of Jeremiah. And then you see that in 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra chapter 1. Over the next century, 3 separate groups of Jewish exiles returned to Jerusalem to rebuild and start over. The first group came under the political leadership of Zerubbabel and the religious leadership of the high priest Jeshua. And that's in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. The returnees tried to rebuild the temple, but had to battle opposition, discouragement, and lack of resources. It was only after the ministries of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah that the second temple was finally finished in 515 BC. Ezra, the priest and scribe, led the second expedition from Babylonia in 458 BC, and that's in Ezra chapter 7 through 10. Ezra's task was not to rebuild the country materially, as the first returnees had done. He was concerned with the social and spiritual well-being of the people. So again, wanted to start up living according to the Lord once again. All right, then we see Nehemiah. He comes along and he led the third return to Jerusalem in 445 BC. That's in Nehemiah chapters 1 through 13. Nehemiah was a Jewish exile who had risen to high office in the Persian royal court. He saw his task primarily as one of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls and providing better defense for its inhabitants. After completion of the wall, Nehemiah stayed in Jerusalem as the governor of the Persian province. And you know that also began the countdown of the prophecy for the coming of Jesus Christ when he went back and rebuilt the walls and the moats of the city. All right, then it wraps up by saying the Old Testament ends with God's people restored to the land and a new temple rebuilt for proper worship of God. Yet this was clearly not a kingdom of God, with a son of David on the throne of an empire with worldwide significance. The promises of God's sacred covenant with his people would have to wait for another time and place. The Old Testament ends in expectation and faith. God would yet fulfill his purposes in his own timing and in his own way. And you know, the rest of the story from there with the coming of Jesus, and then ultimately the second advent of Jesus when he will come and fulfill the covenant promises. All right, so that ends the chapter, okay, chapter 2, and gives us a lot of good information of the historical background of the various kingdoms and empires that existed, and also outside of Israel and then within Israel. And so next week we're going to start in chapter 3, and that is titled The Introduction to the Pentateuch, again, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and the birth of God's people. So we'll talk about that and start to get into that on next week, next Wednesday night. All right? So, any questions at this time? I don't see if I can answer them, but any questions at this time? All right. Okay.
When you showed the Assyrian Empire, and they had conquered all the way down to Egypt, is there any reason that they had just left that